right, so if you're experiencing any issues with your audio during today's session or any sessions in the future, first make sure that your speaker icon on the top left side of the toolbar is green. This means your audio is enabled. If you're still having issues, please refer to the drop-down menus located on the top toolbar for additional assistance. Please also note that if you are joining us through your internet browser, Google Chrome tends to work best with the Adobe Connect platform. We recommend downloading the Adobe Connect desktop app if you are experiencing any issues with your audio or video, as it tends to offer a better experience. There is a chat box located on the right side of your webinar window that can be seen by all webinar participants. You can use this to engage with other attendees, bring any technical difficulties to the speaker's attention for troubleshooting, or to provide any other comments and feedback. During today's session, there will be questions asked by our presenters throughout the presentation, as well as a dedicated Q&A session following the presentation. When asking questions, please use the Q&A box labeled "Submit Questions Here" or turn on your microphone to ask verbally. You can enable your microphone by simply clicking the mic icon on the top toolbar. To answer questions, please use the chat box or turn your microphone on to answer verbally. Please note that there is a dedicated question and answer box labeled "Submit Questions Here," which is located right underneath the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. This is where you will submit any questions that you may have regarding the webinar subject matter. Please keep all questions you wish to be answered by presenters to the Q&A box only and not the chat box to ensure they will not be missed. The Q&A box will be open throughout today's presentation and Q&A. There will be a copy of today's presentation available for download during the Q&A portion of the session next to the chat box. Please let me know in the chat if you are unable to download this file, and I will email it to you directly. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during today's webinar, please notify us in the chat box, and we will do our best to troubleshoot. I will now hand it over to Brian Ricocci, SARM's Manager of Policy and Research, who will be assisting and moderating today's event.
How's that?
Yeah.
Perfect.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Brian Ricocci. I'm the Manager of Policy and Research here at SARM. And today I'll be helping moderate along with Leanne from SaskPower our webinar. Just to do a bit of a brief introduction. So Leanne Jarocki works in public engagement over at SaskPower, and they're here to do a bit of a presentation and discussion and really have an informal conversation with members around the future of sustainable power systems in Saskatchewan and their plans looking into power generation in the future and how we can best set that up in the most sustainable and efficient manner for the province. So with that, Leanne, I'll let you introduce who you've brought with you and take it from there. The time's yours.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Brian. Can everybody hear me okay? Just a thumbs up quick from Brian so I can, everything's good? Okay, thank you. So,
Yep.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today. I want to take just a couple minutes to say thank you, really, because I know there's lots going on right now. It's seeding season on the farm. So I'm very thankful that we're recording this because I know you have, SARM members have lots more going on than talking to SaskPower. So we do appreciate the time that you've taken, those of you that are joining us, and then hope that others can watch the recording afterwards. I know this is probably maybe not the first virtual meeting of your day. Maybe you've got many more virtual meetings, and I know we're all kind of maybe suffering from online fatigue, but it is what it is for now. We have to stay safe. And so we'll use the platforms we have, but we very much look forward to a time when we can get back together and have conversations with people face to face. So speaking of safety, we do always at SaskPower start our meetings with a safety moment. And I wanted to share one with you a personal one, I guess. A friend of mine was telling me that she and her husband they were experiencing headaches. They live just south on an acreage just south of Regina, and they were experiencing headaches. So somebody had suggested, you guys should probably get a CO2, a CO detector, a carbon monoxide detector. And they did. And then on Tuesday night, I believe it was, they were woken up at about 3 o'clock in the morning. Their CO detector went off. So thankfully, they live with their aging parents. So really thankful that they had that installed. So just a reminder to everybody, the critical importance of having one of those, especially now, we're not used to, there's snow, ice maybe built up on outside. So a reminder to keep that in mind as a safety tip in your house. Also, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 4 territory in Regina, which is also the home of the Métis. We acknowledge the land that we're coming from, especially at SaskPower. It's important to do that as we talk about planning the future power system, out of respect for, Indigenous peoples that were here before us, and also because power infrastructure impacts our air, land, and water. And it is an important finding meaningful opportunities for Indigenous engagement is a critical part of our plans for the future power system. So I just want to interrupt. Adam, I'm having trouble moving my slides forward. I'm not sure. Oh, sorry, maybe it's just taking a little bit of time. I apologize. So yeah, sorry, meaningful Indigenous engagement and public engagement is important to SaskPower. Our president has underlined this, and our board has made it a corporate priority now. So just as Indigenous engagement is important, so are finding opportunities for talking with important stakeholders like you, members of rural Saskatchewan, elected officials, people that are leaders in their communities. There's a lot of big decisions coming up when it comes to power generation that Doug and others who have power here today will share with you. And we want to make sure that we find we're not just responding to issues when we talk with you, but we're actually carving out opportunities to have this kind of dialogue and get feedback from people that we serve as we plan the future. Okay. So as we were talking about earlier, there's some big changes coming to SaskPower, the way we operate. The business is changing, the way you use electricity is changing. We have to significantly reduce emissions going forward, and we know that decisions about electricity affect everybody in Saskatchewan in some way, shape, or form. The last time we met with some of you was at the end of November in Regina at Mosaic Stadium, when we had a full day session of conversations about what's coming up, what's important. You had a number of questions, and we summarized all of those questions, and they now exist. That report exists on our website. So what we wanted to talk about today is what's changed since that time. There are some developments that have different regulations that have come into play. You might have heard the Premier yesterday talking about the MOU that's been signed by Ontario, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and now Alberta, the feasibility report that was released on SMRs. So we wanted to update you on that. Sorry, I'm having a hard time getting my go forward. So, sorry. So what we wanted to do today is share some information, what's changed since the last time we spoke, but also to create some time for listening. So we've dedicated some time for questions, hopefully answers. We may not have all of the answers, but we wanted to start to build a process where we can share information back and forth so that we can build that feedback into our plans to the greatest extent possible as we go forward. So I'm going to turn it over now to Doug Opseth. Many of you have probably heard from Doug before. He's our Director of Generation, Asset Management, and Planning at SaskPower. He's responsible essentially for making sure that there's enough power on the system, and that all of those different generation options come together to meet regulatory requirements, emissions requirements, basically that we're able to provide cost-effective, reliable, sustainable power. So Doug's going to speak for a little bit, and then we're going to break and do some, have an opportunity for questions. And then Darcy Holderness, our project manager of the SMR evaluation, planning and development phase that we're in now, is going to share a little bit of information about work on SMRs. And again, we'll have some time for questions. So thanks again, and I'll introduce Doug.
Yeah, does everybody hear me? Leanne, can you hear me there?
I can. Bear with me though, Doug. It's a little slow in transitioning, so I'll try to keep on pace, but just.
And I can move the slides. I think I can move them along too. So
yeah, okay.
I can.
Okay. I'm gonna let you do that.
So anyway, thanks Leanne, thanks Darcy, thanks Adam for inviting SaskPower and myself to be here. It's been a while since I've been at SARM, but I've spoken at SARM a few times. And oh, there you go. And I do miss being around a bunch of people. I remember a couple of years ago, I was at the SARM convention, I think, in Regina, and it was in front of a big room of people, and it was nice to be able to engage with people. But this is what it is today. So I'm going to take you through at a high level some thoughts on our supply plan stuff. And we sit around thinking about this stuff all day. So stuff that seems obvious to us may not be obvious to anybody else. So I think that's where we'd like to get some questions from you guys. So if there's any question you guys have, no matter how simple the question might be, feel free to ask it. We'd love to talk about this stuff. So, probably the last time I was here, there's some things that have stayed the same since then, and some things have changed. Back then we were, dealing with aging infrastructure. I'll say this is probably 2 or 3 years ago. We were dealing with aging infrastructure. We were trying to figure out what we're doing with our coal generation. We were thinking about emissions, but it wasn't really as big an issue as it is today. And the things that have stayed the same, well, we're still dealing with old infrastructure. We got lots of old transmission lines and distribution lines and power plants. We're still trying to decide about what we're doing with that. We're still thinking about our coal generation, but really, carbon emissions and things like that have really become front and center for us. Back probably 2 or 3 years ago, if you heard me speak, I would have said, if we're going to transition out of coal, likely we're going to be building a whole bunch of gas plants. We had our Chinook Power Station, Swift Current under construction. We were at the early stages of thinking about building a twin to Chinook, what's now our Great Plains Power Station construction outside Moose Jaw. And our plans would have been relatively simple. We would have been thinking about, if we're retiring coal, we're building lots of big gas plants. They're really efficient. They emit about half the emissions of a coal plant. They're easy to build. They're relatively economic, and that would have been our plan. But a lot has changed over the last couple of years, and maybe I'll just move the slide ahead here. And the biggest thing that's changing is just federal regulations regarding emissions. We had federal regulations back a number of years ago on conventional coal, and we knew that by 2030 we would have to retire our conventional coal plants. But what's really changed is the focus around emissions now, and the impact emissions and emission regulations are going to have on us and on our business. The federal climate plan was announced in December 2020. A year before that, in 2019, they announced that emissions were going to start applying to more and more gas facilities. We had built our Chinook Power Station, Swift Current. And under the regulations and the current regulations, it doesn't really pay a carbon tax as long as the emissions stay under a certain level. But between us finishing our Chinook Power Station and beginning work on our Great Plains Power Station, regulations have changed. And so whereas the Chinook Power Station doesn't pay a carbon tax, the Great Plains Power Station will pay a carbon tax. Which will eventually, as it moves towards 2030, eventually it will pay a carbon tax. It'll pay for every ton of CO2 it puts up in the air. And that's really changed our thinking about gas generation. And then in December of 2020, the federal government came up with its healthy environment and a healthy economy plan. It spoke about, I won't get into the details of it. You can certainly go and read about it online. but the things it talked about are, it talked about cutting energy waste through efficiency. It talked about clean transportation and power. It talked about carbon pricing, measures for decarbonization of other sectors. It talked about hydrogen. It talked about low carbon fuel and things like that. It put some money, close to $1 billion into advancing things like solar and wind power, grid modernization. It talked about building interties, and it talked about helping to fund some of these things. Discussions are still ongoing on this, but it talked about funding things. In December of last year, we released the SMR. I guess the SMR action plan was released, and it talked about a variety of things. But the biggest impact to us really is around carbon pricing. The carbon and a carbon tax is going to be applied to more and more. More and more of the emissions we put up, more and more of our natural gas power plants are going to be subject to a carbon tax. We'll be paying a carbon tax where maybe they wouldn't have in the past, and that carbon tax is going to be increasing, and that has a big impact on just the cost of running SaskPower, but also on how we're planning for the future. Let me just skip ahead to the next slide. So what is the impact of the carbon tax? Well, first and foremost, it's going to make any fossil fuel generation more expensive. As we build any new power plant we build going forward, we have to anticipate that it will be paying a carbon tax, and that carbon tax now is going to be at $170 a ton. There's a chance it goes up, so it's making the existing generation we have, certainly the coal generation we have, natural gas generation that we have in the planning phases, more expensive to operate. And because that becomes more expensive to operate, it's making the value of renewables, it increases that value. The cost of renewable wind and solar has come down, but really the alternative's gone up a lot. So it means that we're going to try and add lots of renewables as we go forward. It's increased the importance of pricing properly for all the different services we have, and looking at, what are those services and how do we charge properly for it. Also, it's needed to have some discussions around how do we move SaskPower under provincial regulations. And so a lot of people don't really realize, but SaskPower is governed different than a lot of different industries in Saskatchewan, other power producers in Saskatchewan when it comes to how emissions are taxed. And we were governed under the federal carbon pricing system. Other industries are governed under the provincial system. And what we've heard recently from the province is that now that the federal government or the Supreme Court has made a decision on the carbon tax regulations and the legality of that, the province is now talking to the federal government about how do we move SaskPower under the provincial regulations, and what does that look like. So that'll be negotiated here over the next number of months. But really, what's the carbon tax doing? Well, it's driving us to really transform the way in which we do business. Whereas we were thinking about transitioning potentially from conventional coal to things like natural gas fire generation, we're starting to think, is there different ways we need to do that? Because really, as I've said, the carbon tax going higher, it will have an impact on the cost of some of that generation. And really, we're trying to find ways to transition SaskPower to minimize as much as we can the impacts from the carbon tax. Because really, with SaskPower, with a lot of other industries looking to move to zero emissions, transportation sector, agriculture sector, a lot of that will be done through electrification, and SaskPower itself needs to transition to lower emissions as we go forward. And what are the ways we're going to do that? And I'll talk about 3 of them that are kind of the transition phases to where we're going in the future. And those will be around natural gas generation. We still, even though carbon taxes are coming, we will be using some natural gas generation going forward. I'll talk a little bit about renewables, and then I'll talk about increased tie lines. Let me just move the slide forward. There we go. So, with federal regulations now federal regulations have for some time required conventional coal to be retired by 2030. And the challenge we've got as we do that is that some of the things we're thinking about, SMRs, hydrogen storage, and we'll speak about those a little bit, they're not going to be available by 2030. And so we need to find a way to potentially transition away from conventional coal and not jump right into building large natural gas generation. And I'll speak about those. But with regards to natural gas generation, this chart here shows if we are targeting getting to zero emissions by 2050, the blue line you see on here shows a step down approach of what our emissions will have to be to get us to zero emissions by 2030. And what this really shows, and you see these bars along the bottom, these are some of our existing large natural gas facilities. What's this showing is that with our existing natural gas on our system, we are going to be exceeding some of those emission targets we're going to have in the future, and it's going to make it challenging to get to zero emissions if we continue to build large natural gas going forward. So we are going to have to start looking at non-carbon emission or non-natural gas solutions between now and 2050. Gas will still play a role between now and 2030. We may still build some more natural gas facilities, but going beyond 2030, we're likely going to need to be transitioning away from large gas facilities to something else. And what will those something else be? Well, certainly one of the things is going to be increasing amounts of, there's two parts of this. Oh, there we go. Will be increasing amounts of renewable generation on our system. The costs of renewable generation have come down significantly over the coming years, particularly with regards to solar power. There's time, certainly particularly with regards to things like wind power. And you will see growing amounts of wind power coming onto our system over the coming years. Right now, we're sitting at a couple hundred megawatts of wind power in our system, but over the next 3 or 4 years, we'll be moving closer to 1,000 megawatts of wind power on our system. And what's stopping us from adding more wind power is really just building our system out to allow the flexibility to have that intermittent generation on our system. Right now with coal-fired generation on our system and a bunch of other generation that has to run all the time, we're running into challenges with too much wind on our system. And as we start to transition to 2030, we will be able to add more wind and solar on our system. But certainly between now and 2030, you will see growing amounts of solar power and wind power on our system. The next thing is electricity imports, and I'll just bring up all these little bullets here. I talked about transitioning potentially away from conventional coal, and the challenge with that, as I said, is some of the options we're looking at aren't going to be available by 2030. So if we're looking at SMRs or we're looking at hydrogen storage, they will be available after 2030, hopefully, but they won't be available in time to replace retiring conventional coal. So to avoid having to build large infrastructure like large natural gas facilities just to back up and replace retiring coal, we are looking at increasing the amount of tie lines we have with other jurisdictions to Manitoba, south to the US, and west into Alberta. And the benefits of transmission lines really are that they help provide a bridge from potential retirements of conventional coal to whatever's coming next. Because with tie lines, you can import and export electricity as needed. So in the short term, as we're retiring potentially conventional coal, we can import energy from Manitoba, from the US, from Alberta, to help bridge that gap between retiring conventional coal and whatever we're going to build next without having to build things. And then in the future, it will allow us then, as we build out our renewable generation here, potentially build out SMRs in Saskatchewan, we'll have the opportunity then to export energy into other jurisdictions. Increased tie lines also increase grid reliability and grid stability. I think one of the things, I don't know if anybody followed what was going on in Texas recently with some of the cold weather and the storms they were having. Texas is very similar to Saskatchewan in that they are very loosely interconnected to their neighbors. So when you're not really connected with transmission lines to your neighbors, there's no ability for your neighbors to help you out when you get into challenging situations. And with regards to what happened in Texas, when they got into some of those challenging situations where they had cold weather impacting some of their gas generation and other things, they ran into problems trying to supply energy. But so certainly having more tie lines to other jurisdictions will help increase reliability here in Saskatchewan. As I talked about renewable generation, having more tie lines potentially allows us to build unlimited amounts of wind and solar here in Saskatchewan and then export that energy to other jurisdictions. Right now the limitation is we just can't consume all the wind and solar we could build here, but having more tie lines would allow us to take that energy and export it to other jurisdictions. It also helps establish, the tie lines also help establish a framework for a zero emissions grid. Most jurisdictions around the world are moving towards large tie lines to allow energy to flow through different markets. So energy can produce in one area, move to different areas. Most jurisdictions in North America and around the world are moving this direction, and SaskPower will likely have to move this direction as well, just to support our transition to a cleaner future. Yep.
Doug, can you quickly just what is a tie line? Maybe just explain really quickly what we mean.
I'll say what a tie line. Let me go back to that slide. When I say what a tie line, really, it's a transmission line. It's a large transmission line to a different jurisdiction. I think if you look at this slide right here, the picture you see on the side here is a large, large transmission line. And when I say tie line, it's really a big. I think one way of looking at it is like a big giant pipe. It's like a big pipe going from Saskatchewan to other jurisdictions. And what you can do with those pipes is you can move energy in and out of the province. And what that allows us to do is, in the short term, as we're transitioning away from, say, conventional coal, we can import all the energy we need. And the long term, we can then use it to export energy. And the nice thing about it is it doesn't require us to build large infrastructure here. If we don't have transmission lines, likely we're going to be having to build large natural gas facilities, which then you're going to want to run for 30 years, which makes it more challenging to get to zero emissions.
Good, thank you. There is a question in the chat. How do you see the carbon price affecting our plans for natural gas, and how much carbon tax are we paying now?
Well, I can certainly get you the number. I don't have the number off the top of my head about how much carbon tax we're paying now, but how does it impact us? The higher the carbon tax it goes, it impacts how much the cost of electricity is going to be for our customers. So, and how it's impacting our plans. As that carbon tax is going up, we're starting to look at other forms of generation. It's making other forms of generation more economic on our system. So it's having an impact on our plans. Like 2 years ago, I would have said, what are our plans for the future? And if we were retiring conventional coal, it would have been to build large combined cycle gas plants like the Great Plains facility in Moose Jaw, the Chinook Power Station out in Swift Current. But now what it's doing is making us think about building smaller scale natural gas generation, increasing renewables, and it's really driving us to really focus in on what are those low and non-emitting technologies that are potentially available in beyond 2030. And those are things like SMRs, hydrogen production, and things like that.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple more questions in the chat. This one is also about imports, and it says, from where is it clean power? So when we import power, is it considered clean power?
Well, it depends. Right now, we've got some contracts with Manitoba Hydro where we're importing energy out of Manitoba, and I'll say that is zero emissions energy. It's coming from hydro facilities there. So you can import power of different sources. Typically, as we're looking to bring our emissions down, we will be looking to bring in energy that is non-emitting energy from different jurisdictions. Typically, that'd be hydro, wind, solar energy coming from other jurisdictions. And is it less expensive? Yeah.
And then, sorry, can you
I can see the questions there. So, is it less expensive than building things here? Typically, yeah. I'll say the nice thing about imports is that the energy may cost similar to the energy we might produce here, but you can avoid building all the infrastructure. I guess the challenge we're having as you look at, let me bring up this one graph here. If we're trying to get to zero emissions, and we do have to get to zero emissions at some point, it's not really a question of if we try to get to zero emissions, it's a question of when we're going to have to get to zero emissions. Is it 2050? Is it 2040? The U.S. is talking about getting there by 2030. We will have to get to zero emissions at some point. So what the nice thing about imports is that, yes, it may cost the same on an energy basis, but you can avoid building the large infrastructure here. So if you have to build a large natural gas facility, typically to make that economic to do, you would expect to run that for 30 years. The challenge of it is that if we're trying to get to zero emissions by 2050, you will have to start shutting some of those big plants off before they get to the end of their life, which drives up their cost significantly. So while we still need some gas generation in Saskatchewan, likely we can use imports as a means to bring in the energy we need in the short term to bridge that gap between potentially retiring coal and whatever we're going to do next. And maybe that whatever we're going to do next is going to be SMRs. Maybe it'll be something else. But we need a little bit of time between when coal potentially retires in 2030 and when those other options are available. And the nice thing is that tie lines and transmission lines give us the ability to bridge that gap without having to build a bunch of infrastructure here in Saskatchewan, then maybe you regret having built.
That's interesting. And then there's a question here about hydro in Saskatchewan. Sorry, why we have so many lakes and rivers? I know I get asked this question.
Hydro is something we look at. The challenge is, hydro is challenging to build, and most of the really good areas for hydro dams here in Saskatchewan have been developed, and it's becoming much more challenging to build. We've developed a lot of hydro in southern Saskatchewan. Most of the good hydro sites have been built right now. The remaining sites are likely more expensive or are in areas that are quite sensitive environmentally to regulations. So we certainly do look at it, but it is a relatively expensive option right now. But it is something that we continue to monitor and continue to look at.
And then Larry has a question about opposition. I wouldn't mind just speaking to that really quickly around, that is something that we watch, Larry, on our engagement team and across the company. All of the people from SaskPower watch as well how other energy projects unfold across Canada. And I think what we see obviously is that signal to us that early engagement is critical. Nobody likes having big infrastructure on their property, on their land, right? I mean, I think I know here in Saskatchewan, it's hard to have farm equipment moving around large infrastructure like that. So there are opportunities for, developing corridors. I mean, that's certainly something I know we've looked at in the past, but the critical piece is sharing information. It's like Jay had said earlier, I included that quote from him, sharing information early, finding ways to mitigate impacts of infrastructure as much as possible going forward. I don't know if Doug, if you have
I think to Leon's point, we need to engage in everything we're doing. I think whether it's transmission lines or generation plants, I think we're going to need to have discussions with everybody about these things, because there's no easy options. I mean, the challenge we've got from an electricity standpoint is there is no magic solution to keeping to low-cost energy that's non-emitting, and there's going to be trade-offs, whether it's transmission lines or SMRs or natural gas generation, and it really requires us to engage with the public, so that, as we're engaging here with you guys today, is to engage with the public, to get your thoughts on some of this thing, and involve everybody in Saskatchewan in some of the big decisions we have to make. And has Manitoba incurred significant resistance to their transmission lines? They did run into some challenges when they were building Bipole 3. When you're building large transmission lines, I'll say most people don't like seeing large transmission lines or go across their property, no more than they like living necessarily next to a large power plant. But it does lead to the need to engage with stakeholders. I mean, as they were building that project, they ended up rerouting parts of their line to accommodate some of the interest they heard from stakeholders. So in the end, they managed to find a solution, but it required them to engage a lot with First Nation groups and with people along the route to find that right solution. And I think the fact they started early on the engagement allowed them to make those changes without significantly delaying some of their projects. And large transmission corridors, these are discussions we have to have, because to facilitate a lot of what we're going to do is going to require us building things, and so we do need to engage with the public on things like transmission corridors.
So Brian, are there any other questions? This kind of wraps up the first part of our presentation. The second part, we have Darcy Holderness, who's our project manager of the planning and development phase of what could be the first of possibly many SMRs in Saskatchewan. So he was going to share some information about that option, but if there's any more questions about anything Doug was talking about, if people want to come off mute, go ahead, or throw your question into the box.
I don't see any more. However, if we have missed one by for some reason or another, we can make sure to follow up with SaskPower and Doug's group and make sure we get it back to the members and stuff like that. So I think at this time we're okay to go ahead with Darcy and his presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Darcy. If you wanna go ahead, I think you can operate the slide directly like Doug was doing.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Leanne and Doug, and similar to them, thanks to everyone else who's here. We're excited to be starting some conversations on these big energy projects, and it's mandatory and required for us to have these conversations as we kind of progress through this transition. So I'm going to go through one of the projects that we have is to develop the SMRs as a potential future option for Saskatchewan. And so really we've done a lot of feasibility work on this to date. You guys may have heard the announcement from Scott Moe yesterday. He released a feasibility analysis that was done on SMRs at the same time that Alberta signed on to an interprovincial agreement to work together as we evaluate this technology and consider it for deployment. But so really we've made a recommendation to our board recently, and they've approved it just last month to advance from the feasibility stage into what we're calling the planning phase for SMRs. The feasibility work really pointed towards potential for SMRs to be cost competitive, reliable, emissions-free power generation option for Saskatchewan, and that's the reason that we're advancing into this planning phase. So I've got some slides to talk about kind of milestones and where we're going with the planning phase and when it might lead to construction decisions later on. But I think we're going to start with just some background around nuclear power here. So SMRs are small modular reactors. The small kind of means they're in the 50 to 300 megawatt range. That's electric megawatts. And we're kind of targeting the upper end of that, the 300 megawatt range, which is similar size to our larger size coal facilities in the province. So it fits into our grid and our market in Saskatchewan quite nicely. The modular is that's just speaking to the reactor vessel itself. Is small enough that it's built off-site in a shop environment. These are smaller nuclear projects, but they're still large size in terms of cost and schedule risk. So having a lot of work done off-site in the shop environment really de-risks it from a cost and schedule perspective. There's been some issues in the nuclear industry with these projects because they're so massive on the cost and schedule side. And then the reactor, I mean, the energy source is a nuclear fission process and a reaction. So that's just speaks to the nuclear side of things there. So some key requirements for Saskatchewan, this really kind of came out of the feasibility work that has been done and that we've been doing for the last decade or so on SMRs. So we had to have a national approach. So we were looking for a pan-Canadian approach to the development of this technology. And we needed some utility partners with a successful first-of-a-kind project demonstrated in Canada. Us being a greenfield jurisdiction when it comes to nuclear power, it adds a lot of risk if we're also going to be contemplating new nuclear technology within that same project. So we really are looking towards a demonstration that the project can have success in another jurisdiction in Canada before we implement it in Saskatchewan. And some of those things are coming together, and we have some information on some other projects that we're tracking and partnerships we're developing with other utilities in Canada. You're familiar with that interprovincial agreement. Ontario and New Brunswick have extensive experience in the nuclear industry. Saskatchewan brings experience in the uranium mining industry, and Alberta recently signed on to that agreement as well. So we're looking to bring in some expertise from existing nuclear operations in Canada We also have a strong regulatory regime in Canada in the nuclear side. It's been very well developed. It's well respected in the world, uh, which helps a lot. And we're going to lean on that previous experience and those relationships to help build our competence and qualifications as a nuclear jurisdiction in Saskatchewan. Another part of it is Indigenous participation. This is it's a huge opportunity and it's a requirement for nuclear related projects, big energy projects in general as well. And so we really see this as building on the relationships that the uranium mining has done, and we view this as a big opportunity for the SMR project is Indigenous participation. Federal risk sharing was talked about a little bit. So we're looking to the federal government to help us out as we move through this planning phase, and this is coming from a funding perspective. We're looking for some help on the planning phase costs as we move through and develop this supply option. It's going to take a lot of investment for us to get our capacity and our competence up to a level that's acceptable for the nuclear industry. So the early investment is required even as we move through this planning phase before we might make a final decision on whether to build a nuclear power plant or not in Saskatchewan. And I mean, competitive price of power, these have to be economic. That's our number one driving point for evaluating this supply option. And when it comes time to make a decision, it's going to have to be economic compared to other options that are on the table. And so it's a very key criteria as we move through the planning phase to make sure we're watching the business case for nuclear power and how it would affect rates in Saskatchewan and things like that. So outside of reliable, emissions-free, cost-competitive power, there are some other benefits to Saskatchewan of a nuclear power project. This is a big project. It's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of construction activity, and there's economic impact to the province that can be measured in GDP. The Conference Board of Canada recently released a report that has some numbers on jobs and GDP for the province associated with development of nuclear power in the province. So we'd encourage you guys to find that information, and we can provide it if you like. So this is another option into the mix as well. So it could reduce our reliance on natural gas as we kind of drive towards a net zero grid by 2050. And so having some other options out there, it really helps. We don't know what the price of natural gas is going to be for the next 30 years, and the carbon penalties as well are questionable. So that really having other options in the mix is really important to us. SMRs support an aggressive deployment of renewables. We don't view SMRs as competing with renewables at all, at least right now. SMRs are compared to conventional reactors, they're much more flexible in terms of load following, ramping the load up and down to follow renewables as they're available. And so those types of things come into play, and they can complement renewables to a high degree. There's some of the advanced reactors have thermal energy storage, or we can consider things like hydrogen production. In times when we have high renewables, we can divert that energy towards other things. And so those types of things just help with the business case and the long-term benefits of this as a supply option. So this side is just some examples of actual designs, reactor designs that are being advanced in Canada. This is all of them in the SMR space. The first three you'll see is a short list of technologies that's being considered for Ontario and Saskatchewan. So these are the three reactors we've shortlisted and we're evaluating right now as potential for Saskatchewan. Ontario is also evaluating the same shortlist, and they're the ones that are implementing that first mover project that we're looking to de-risk the technology in itself. the construction price, the construction schedule, the operating requirements of this technology is all going to be de-risked through that first mover project in Ontario, and then we might follow in Saskatchewan. And so that's GE Hitachi, their BWRX 300 reactor. It's the X Energy, has an XE100. It's a high temperature gas cooled reactor. And then a terrestrial, which is a Canadian design. They have a molten salt cooled reactor that's in the mix as well there. The next two on this list are two that New Brunswick is advancing. There was some funding recently announced for the Moltex reactor from the federal government with New Brunswick. These are advanced reactor designs, and so the timing on these two is probably going to be a little bit later than Ontario and possibly even the first Saskatchewan project. But they come with some other benefits that we could talk about as well. And then the final two on this list are two very small reactors, or micro reactors they're called. So they're in the category that's below the 50 megawatt range. These two are 5 megawatt reactors. The business case for these are really off-grid locations or remote locations where there's a significant energy or power need. Global First Power has a micro reactor that they're advancing at Chalk River in Ontario. That's an Ontario Power Generation, or CNL, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, is a company that is advancing this project. Then Ontario with Bruce Power also has a Westinghouse reactor that they're developing. So these this is a picture of the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station. It's one of the biggest nuclear facilities in Canada. It's located just 75 kilometers from downtown Toronto. It's a 3,500 megawatt facility. So this facility could power Saskatchewan on most days. It's based on the CANDU reactor technology, which is it's Canada's design. It's one of the top engineering achievements that Canada has produced in the last 50 years. And that's really what OPG and the regulatory process kind of grew up understanding is this CANDU reactor, and it's been implemented across the world in some areas. But there's 6 million people that live within 100 kilometers of this facility, and it provides 20% of all of Ontario's power. So it's a very large facility with a big footprint. This is also the site where OPG, or Ontario Power Generation, has licensed for the first SMR in Canada. So that first mover project will be located on a brownfield nuclear site, which is a little bit different than what we're developing in Saskatchewan, obviously. But just to kind of compare the footprint of this type of facility to what these small reactors look like. This is a footprint of a very small reactor. You can see it's a lot smaller in size and area. This is an air-cooled condenser, so if you had some water in here, it would be even smaller than this. This is Ultra Safe Nuclear Corporation. So this is the design that they're implementing at Chalk River in Ontario. It just gives you a feel for what the very small reactors look like. And the SMRs, or the small reactors, are not that much bigger, to be honest. This is a schematic of a molten salt cooled reactor, so it'd be something similar to the terrestrial design. It fits into a space about this 35 acres. So 300 megawatts into a square footage of 35 acres. It's really not that much space. Here's just a side profile of this is the GE Hitachi BWRX 300 reactor. So this is one of the technologies we're considering for Saskatchewan. The reactor is buried substantially underground, so you don't see a large footprint outside of that. And so you'd have a reactor facility connected to a reactor island connected to a power island, which would house a similar size turbine and generating station to what we have in our existing larger size coal plants. So what we're doing, this planning phase on our project that we're starting right now, we're forecasting it's going to take about 7 years to get through the planning phase and to the point where we can make a decision on whether to build a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan or not. We have a lot of work to do to get to that point, obviously. Uh, Site selection, technology selection are two of the first things that we need to have done. You'll see that those are going to take some very early amounts of effort and action to progress, and that's going to let us progress into the regulatory processes. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has a very intense licensing process for Class 1 nuclear power stations, which is what an SMR would be. And we need to initiate that ahead of making a construction decision for this project. The impact assessment is going to be very intense, and that's going to have to progress as well to the point of completion, actually. So the federal process will be initiated probably in the next 2 years, and the impact assessment will be underway as we develop this supply option. Engagement is a huge part of any major project, and especially so for a nuclear project. So the Indigenous stakeholder, customer, public engagement is going to be intense, and we're really looking forward to getting this underway as we get into this planning phase and develop this supply option. So the other things we have to do is evaluate business models and make sure we're monitoring and have a full understanding of the business case. So the costs, the schedule, the operating requirements, and the risks. We have to understand all of that to a very high degree as we move through the planning phase leading up to that decision. So just to give you an idea of timeline, it's a busy slide, but it shows kind of our long-term plan for this project and this supply option. You can see we're right here kind of at the beginning of 2021, and we're starting this planning phase, which is going to last 7 to 8 years before we start making some construction decisions in the 2028-2029 timeframe. And that will lead to a commercial operation date by around 2033. This is probably the earliest we could have this type of facility operating, given where we're at today. There might be some opportunity to advance that a little bit, depending on how things go. There's also a lot of risk. These regulatory processes are quite intense, and they're not exactly straightforward when it comes to scheduling. So these could get bumped out, and some of these dates could get moved back 1 to 2 years quite easily as we progress through. So as far as starting this planning phase, we've got the site evaluation and technology selection. We need to get those two things moving and underway, and we're in the process of advancing those two areas. And that's going to lead into those regulatory processes. So you can see the 3 bars kind of in the middle here identify a license to prepare a site for a nuclear facility, which is the first one, followed by a construction license and then an operating license. And you need all 3 of those leading up to a commercial operation of this type of facility. And then near the bottom, you can see our impact assessment process. The new federal process is quite lengthy, but it's something we're going to have to get going, and we want to be right through that process before we make our go or no-go decision on the construction phase of this supply option. And then right near the bottom, you can see the engagement. It's going to be intense, and it's going to carry right through from where we are today, right through the planning phase and through a life cycle for a nuclear facility. And then at the absolute bottom, I've got a little bit of information on where OPG is at with their Darlington new nuclear project, which is that first mover project that's de-risking a lot of the aspects of the SMR world for us. They're planning to be in commercial operation by 2028, which is about 5 years before we would have our facility in operation. And really it allows the construction models to be proven and even a little bit of operating experience before we make our final investment decision on this type of technology. So I think that covers our project and the main points I wanted to run through here, Leanne.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Darcy. Does anybody have any questions, I guess, about some of the work that Darcy just described? We'll give people a couple minutes if you want to ask a question in the question box, or please, if you feel if you want, come off mute and talk with us.
I see there's a couple questions down. Oh, go ahead if somebody.
Here we go. Oh, yeah. So, sorry, somebody, go ahead if whoever's speaking.
Hey, maybe.
Okay, we have one here, Darcy. Where would you put a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan? Where would you put, I guess, an SMR in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, that's one thing we're starting to evaluate right now. So what we're doing now is collecting a lot of the information. We're pouring through a lot of regulatory documents and requirements, really understanding from a technical perspective what's required from a host site for a nuclear facility, and we're running through a regional type of analysis to look at potential areas that could technically host this type of facility. And then there's going to be, after that, we're going to need to drill down and find an actual site within regions that are potential host areas. So there's going to be a lot of work this year as we run through and develop this criteria, and then we'll be engaging and working with a lot of different communities on how we find that site and select it. There's a lot of regulatory requirements around, showing you have emergency services, a workforce that can operate the unit nearby. From a technical perspective, we're going to need a pretty significant water body to cool the steam out of the generator, and that's typical or out of the turbine, sorry. That's typical with our large thermal facilities. So you need that body of water. So there's some things that are going to narrow where it's technically possible to do it, and then we're going to evaluate and go from there.
Yeah, and Larry has asked a question about, I think that answered Larry's question, but are there any specific site requirements? Yes, absolutely. Just to build on what Darcy has already touched on, the process we'll use for siting an SMR will be similar to the process that we've used for siting other power infrastructure, but also obviously different, right? Because we have different requirements for not only engagement but also following up on the different siting requirements, the water use, all of those things. The thing that I'm learning as I work more closely with our project team and our team leads on siting is there's a significant amount of existing research that we're able to use to determine, to kind of narrow down our siting regions or locations based on working with OPG, Ontario Power Generation, and New Brunswick Power. Canada has a strong nuclear industry, so we're able to get leverage some of that expertise, as well as some of the work that our company has done siting infrastructure in the past. There's another question here, Darcy, about will SMRs provide an opportunity for risk mitigation for extreme weather events like ice and storms impacting grid lines?
Yeah, well, this might be geared towards like grid stability, or is he talking about like risk to the facility itself? We look at that from.
I think. Yeah, I think it looks like, because he says, ice and storms impacting major power lines, right? So will this would an SMR kind of offset that risk, or help, I guess, with grid resilience in any way, shape, or form?
Well, we need transmission lines to move the power around the province. So in a sense, if you don't have transmission lines, SMRs don't provide any more stability than any of our other existing generation does. The SMRs themselves require to be there. It's very rigorous, the design, when in terms of looking at extreme weather, extreme events. They have very intense design basis for the facilities themselves, and then you have to look at beyond design conditions. So things like long-term climate change and long-term economic activity in different areas can put stress on the resources, which have to be factored when you're designing and building a nuclear facility like this. So the design of the facility itself is much more rigorous, I would say, than conventional power options in terms of extreme weather conditions and events, but you're still reliant on the transmission system and the distribution system to move that power around. So from a grid stability standpoint, in that sense, I don't think we're any more reliable than other power options, I guess.
Larry, can you hear Darcy? You had a question about Darcy's audio. I'm just wondering if you heard what he was saying. Brian, are we having technical difficulties? Sorry.
I don't have any on our end, so it may be something, Larry, on your end of things.
The good thing is we've got this recorded, so we can, Larry can watch the answer afterwards, or definitely reach out to us, Larry, if you have more questions or want to talk with us directly. Any other questions specifically on nuclear power or anything we've talked about?
Leanne, if you don't mind, I've got a question, Darcy, and it maybe is one to direct to the province as opposed to the utility, but I'll ask it anyways. Have you guys done any analysis or any initial research into the economic impact of what an SMR would do to the province, or as far as job creation or just overall economic activity? As you know, there's a lot of sectors in the province that are struggling, and I think any economic activity would be a welcome sign in Saskatchewan. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and there is an opportunity or part of a benefit, I guess, of a mega project like a nuclear power facility for economic impact, regionally and provincially. It's going to promote our uranium mining industry, and there's a lot of benefits on that side, Brian. There's the Conference Board of Canada report that I mentioned earlier does speak to those specific numbers. If we did deploy nuclear power and it's successful as an option in Saskatchewan, we took a look at what the impact would be of building 4 300 megawatt facilities in Saskatchewan. And the numbers in there are quite significant in terms of GDP impact on the province, job creation, opportunities for Saskatchewan. They're there, and so that's a definite benefit of this supply option anyway.
Brian, we have a link to that report on our website. I can direct you to that, or just go to saskpower.com and check out our SMR page, and you can see the link to that report that has a summary of the economic impact, the questions that you were asked.
Oh, sure, great, thanks.
Yeah. There's one question here, Darcy, about how many people would work at a nuclear power plant, at an SMR plant.
Yeah, if Ian is still with us, he might have the exact numbers. I don't have them on my fingertips right now, but it's. I'll just give Ian a second.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer is that we're still we're early on in the process of selecting a technology, and each design will come with a unique requirement for operators. But based on our initial assessment, regardless of which technology we choose, the number of jobs created once the plants are constructed, and remember the proposal in Saskatchewan ultimately is to deploy our first unit by 2032-33, and then add additional units, 3 additional units between 2035 and 2042. So we'll be adding 1,200 megawatts of power over that period, and the number of people that would be required to run those plants is about equivalent to the number of people that we have working in our coal plants today. So we think that the number of long-term operating jobs is going to be about the same. The nuclear industry wages are slightly higher than the wages in conventional coal plants, so the value of those jobs might be slightly higher. The economic impact, though, goes beyond the direct jobs, and it includes indirect jobs, just like our coal plants do today, where Estevan and Coronach have lots of people at workforce in those plants, and there's lots of other people that are employed in those areas because of the economic activity generated by the coal plants. So we think at the very least, the jobs impact is going to be net positive in the long run. The construction of those plants, though, is going to require a lot of people. We think that the construction, if we get to a construction decision in 2029, the first plant will be built over 3 years, between 2029 and 2033. According to the Conference Board report, they estimate about 1,600 to 1,700 jobs will be created per year on average through each year of construction. So from 2029 all the way through to 2042. And then the development phase between now and 2032, actually up to 2036 for all 4 plants, about 200 jobs. So you can see that the impact of SMR development for the province is going to be very strong. That's one of the things that really makes it attractive to our province, is that it holds the very strong potential to create an economically sustainable transition from to a clean energy future, and it will give us part of the solution to transitioning from fossil energy to non-emitting energy as we move towards 2040 and 2050. The other benefit that is going to accrue, not just jobs and economic activity, but taxes. These are big projects that generate a lot of taxes, federal, provincial, and municipal. I believe that we have information about that on our website. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but there's significant hundreds of millions of dollars generated in taxes between now and 2032, and hundreds of millions, a few billion more after that in the construction and operation of these plants. So overall, we're talking about a pretty major construction project, so it's not surprising the economic activity, the job creation, and the taxes that would be paid as a result of that work are pretty substantial for our province. And the good news for Canada is that while most of the jobs, about 2/3 of the jobs and 2/3 of the economic activity are in Saskatchewan, there's lots of jobs created in other parts of Canada that would be required to support the work we're doing here in Saskatchewan. So it's good news for the whole country, not only from an economic perspective, but also from an environmental perspective, because as the federal Minister of Natural Resources and our Premier have said quite often, and this has been echoed by many other technical studies, it's very difficult to get to net zero by 2050 if we don't expand our nuclear offerings in Canada, and the same is true in the United States.
Ian, maybe if you have time, there's a couple questions here about fuel. There's one question about thorium, and then there's another question about using Saskatchewan uranium in your SMR. Do you have time to?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I do. So so first of all, if you think about Saskatchewan produces 20% of the world's uranium, and we have the highest quality uranium production of any uranium mining jurisdiction globally. It's a very important export product for us, and it supports a pretty substantial job creation in the northern part of our province. Has been a great economic development opportunity for our Indigenous communities in that area. So the development of SMRs in Saskatchewan for plants is not going to require is not going to put that's not a lot of uranium. Keep in mind, uranium is so energy dense, it doesn't take very much of it to generate a lot of power. So Saskatchewan's SMRs are going to support, obviously, increased use of Saskatchewan uranium, and 100% of the uranium required to make the fuel for our power plants will come from Saskatchewan. We also have commitments from Ontario that 100% of the uranium required for its SMRs will also come from Saskatchewan. So that's a big priority for our province as we advance. The potential opportunity for Saskatchewan's uranium resources is that SMRs demonstrated in Saskatchewan it will create an opportunity for SMRs to be deployed in other jurisdictions. Saskatchewan has not been nuclear power has not been a major opportunity in Saskatchewan because our grid is small and conventional nuclear units are big, too big for our grid, too big for our system. But SMRs in the 300 megawatt range per generating unit, and somewhere between 50 and 300 megawatts, which is the ones we're looking at, that fits very well into Saskatchewan's grid, and it will fit well into many other grids that are trying to transition from coal and gas to a cleaner energy future. So the market globally for SMR deployment is estimated at somewhere between $150 billion and $300 billion between now and 2040. And Saskatchewan will be one of the first jurisdictions in the world to deploy SMRs in a scenario where you have a small grid and where there's not nuclear power generation here already. So the opportunity for Saskatchewan's uranium is not just to fuel Saskatchewan's reactors, but to significantly expand the global market for uranium as SMRs are deployed in other jurisdictions. And with regard to thorium, so it's true that thorium has the potential to be a pretty good source of nuclear fuel, but Saskatchewan is not considering designs that use thorium because we have a very robust supply of high quality uranium. In the future, and in the future, we may, although I don't anticipate that would be a major priority for our province over the next number of decades. But thorium may be an option for jurisdictions that don't have uranium and want to create a secure supply of nuclear fuel. And it's one of the advantages of thorium is that it produces much less long-lived nuclear waste than fuel that is made with uranium. So it's not a great fit for Saskatchewan, and the amount of waste that's generated from nuclear power is so small. And we have
thank you. I'm having a couple of technical issues. I don't know. Ian was cutting out, but it looks like I've got full green bars now. Jennifer had a question about will an SMR facility be owned and operated, or will it by SaskPower? Sorry, or will it be an IPP? I know we're looking at business model now, but either Ian or Darcy, did you want to answer that one?
You're cutting out, Leanne, but I think I got the gist of the question. We haven't made that decision. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, Ian, we can hear you now on our end of things.
Okay. Well, so I think the question is, would SaskPower build and operate a nuclear power plant, or would somebody else build it for us? And the answer to that question is we haven't decided yet. The options available to us are the same options that we always have. SaskPower has built, owned, and operated power plants, coal plants, and gas plants in the past. We built, owned, and operated hydro projects in the past, and that is certainly an option that we're exploring for nuclear development. What makes nuclear different is that SaskPower has no experience building and operating nuclear power plants. And so one of the other option would be to have somebody else build it and we would just purchase the power. And then the option that is more likely would be a joint venture where we bring in partners with deep nuclear experience. There's an opportunity for indigenous investment. There's an opportunity for other private sector investment then that helps spread the risk of these projects. And we're looking at all those options of SaskPower build, own, operate, a joint venture that SaskPower would be involved with, or the potential for a power purchase agreement with SaskPower to be the catalyst for a private sector development of SMRs. What I can tell you though is in the world, no one has ever built a nuclear power plant, commercial nuclear power plant, solely on the strength of a power purchase agreement with the utility. The financing of nuclear plants is complex and generally requires has always required more than just a PPA. We expect that to be the case here. So I don't see a scenario where SaskPower wouldn't be involved in this project as an owner. But it may be that we bring in partners
Awesome.
to
Adam or Brian, I've lost audio over the last couple minutes.
That's a decision that we'll make
so
over the
if we
next,
haven't addressed all the
years.
questions, I'll rely on you to pick up on what we haven't already answered or addressed.
Sure, Leanne, you're coming in okay now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine, Brett.
Okay, so maybe we've lost Leanne again. Just a couple more questions. I think we've gotten to most of them, but another one we had come through, and I can throw this to either Darcy or Ian, whoever wants to answer, is that we hear that SMRs are really expensive and very capital intensive. What will be the impact on our rates going forward if we do decide to proceed?
Maybe I'll take that one. You heard Darcy say talk a little bit in his presentation about the criteria that we are going to use to evaluate the potential for SMRs in Saskatchewan. And the number one criteria, by a long way, is cost. The electricity from SMRs needs to be competitive compared to the alternative zero emissions baseload options that we could get from somewhere else. So today, the only option is hydro, either from Saskatchewan or imported from a different jurisdiction, clean energy from a different jurisdiction. And in the future, we also expect that wind and solar supported by energy storage may be an option. And then there are smaller opportunities in Saskatchewan for generation from sources like biomass and geothermal, which could also contribute. But regardless of what our generation mix looks like in 2030 and 2040, if for SMRs to be feasible, we need to ensure that they do not increase the price of power compared to other options that we would have available to us in Saskatchewan. And so that's the criteria. So I guess the answer to your question is that we believe there's strong potential for power from SMRs to be economically competitive with other generation options, and that will be a requirement for us to proceed.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I lost my audio there. So I did want to
Leanne,
touch on, there were a couple of things. I know there's probably a couple other questions to answer, but I didn't want to leave this presentation today without inviting all SARM members. I know we're going to send an invitation to Ray and to Jay and to a couple others, and we want to make sure that you're all invited to something that we're hosting in early May. It's called a deliberative dialogue, and we're having 2 sessions in May, and it'll be the first time that SaskPower has ever invited people from different perspectives and different backgrounds to come together and have a conversation about the future power system in Saskatchewan, to start to really look into the combination of options that we're exploring, whether that's SMRs or carbon capture and storage, or bringing in hydro from outside of, or bringing in electricity from outside of Saskatchewan, Manitoba hydro, or otherwise, wind, solar, all of the options. There's a number of trade-offs, obviously, and things that we need to be considering, and that's really what our engagement is going to be all about, is inviting people to have conversations with us so that we can understand what is important to you, our members and others, as we plan this future power system. So I will send out a link to that, definitely it'll come out probably through Jay. But I guess just we have a few more minutes for questions. If we missed anything, Brian, sorry, while I was out, please go ahead and continue following up questions. I just didn't want to lose that point in case my audio went out again.
Yeah, no, sure, no problem, Leanne. And you know what? If you want, you can send us that contact information, and we have a couple of tools that we can use to push that out to our members to make sure we have everybody the chance to participate in that if they choose. So that's great news. We did have, I think, one last question here that we didn't get to, and it was around waste and the storage of waste, and would it happen here in Saskatchewan, or if there's been any planning on what exactly we would do with some of the nuclear waste that would be produced out of an SMR, possibly in Saskatchewan. So that's the last one I have.
Yeah, I can answer that, and then if I miss anything, or if my audio cuts out, ask Darcy or Ian to supplement that answer. I was actually just looking into this a bit, reminding myself about the process for nuclear used fuel and waste management. We had a question from an employee about that. So usually waste from used fuel and waste, there's different levels. There's the really low, the intermediate, and then the highly radioactive waste is stored after it's stored in pools of water right at the power station site. You'll see cooling ponds, I think they're called. So that the fuel sits there for in and around 10 years, I think, and then it's moved into longer term, what they call dry casks, so stored above ground. And at this point, it's Canada has an agency called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and they are responsible for managing the long-term storage for coming up with a plan to manage the long-term storage of nuclear used fuel and waste in Canada. Right now, they've got a couple of sites in Ontario that they're exploring. So what would happen, Brian, would, we would store it on site most likely. And then once the Nuclear Waste Management Organization has a site selected, it would be put in what they call a deep geological repository, so underground. And at this point, it looks like that would be in Ontario. There were some sites in Saskatchewan that were looked at, but it was either via, as a result of public acceptance, lack of public acceptance, or just the geology of the land in Saskatchewan that wasn't appropriate. Is there anything I missed, Ian or Darcy, that you want to add to that? Okay, it looks like I've lost audio again, so I don't know how far I got into my answer.
That's okay, Lan. We can hear you.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Darcy just texted me and said he completely lost audio as well. Sorry.
Okay.
This is the challenges of remote engagement, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, Leanne, with that, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I guess I would just offer the opportunity if you guys have any last kind of closing statements or last remarks, and we can kind of conclude today's session.
Absolutely. So as I don't know if Ian's still on the call. Did you have any kind of closing comments, Ian? I know Darcy probably did, but he's lost audio. Apologies.
Hi, Leanne. Ian had to leave the session.
Okay, thank you. So I guess my only closing comment would be thank you so very much for taking the time to join us today. We do have a survey. I'm going to send out a link through SurveyMonkey. We're looking to measure, what kind of information we're sharing now. How do you want to continue the conversation with us, right? And this is, the first of what we hope to be many conversations with this group and other, specifically if you want us to come out and talk with your council or however you wish to do that. We are really looking forward to a time when we can sit down and have a conversation face to face, and we don't have these audio and technical issues, but we know it is what it is, so we'll do whatever we can to make sure that we're able to answer your questions and learn more about what matters to you as we go forward.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Leanne. That's great. And we'd like to just kind of thank you and your colleagues at SaskPower as well for coming in and bringing in this very interesting presentation today. SaskPower and rural Saskatchewan and RMs have a very intertwined relationship, as most of your assets, both generation and transmission, go through rural Saskatchewan, and so there's been a long-standing relationship there, and so maintaining this strong engagement and back and forth, I think, is vital and extremely important to our members to make sure that everybody's on the right page, and we appreciate the ability to talk to you guys today and ongoing in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, guys. Have a great day, everybody.
All right, you too, Leanne. All right, Adam, well, I guess that'll wrap us up. We've only got a couple minutes left, so to everyone that stayed on, thanks very much for your participation. If we missed any questions, please feel free. We will record the chat box, or feel free to reach out at us, and we can make sure that we get back to SaskPower and get you an answer on anything that we have missed.